December 19th, 1944. Somewhere east of Stavelot, in the white silence of the Ardennes, the day broke late and mean. Snow had settled into the shell holes like ash in old wounds. Pine branches bowed under frost. The road was hard as iron, glazed with the cold shine of a continent that had been burning for 5 years and was now freezing over its own ruin. In the half-light, German officers moved past wrecked vehicles and splintered crates toward what their maps and scouts had marked as an American service area. They expected fuel first, perhaps ammunition, perhaps abandoned transport. Instead, among the smoke-blackened canvas and the churned mud turned to ice, they found a field kitchen. A ladle lay in the snow beside a steel vat. Bread trays were overturned. Tin cups were scattered like dull metals. And through the bitter smell of cordite, antifreeze, and wet wool, there drifted something stranger than all the rest, the stubborn scent of coffee, still clinging to the cold metal as if the Americans had only just stepped away. That smell, thin but unmistakable, carried an insult deeper than any artillery barrage. It suggested not panic, not collapse, but routine interrupted. It suggested men who had expected to eat again, in war. That assumption could be more terrifying than bravado. The moment mattered because the German offensive in the Ardennes had been conceived as a gamble against time, fuel, and reality itself. Hitler's last great Western offensive, launched on December 16th, aimed to split the Allied armies, seize Antwerp, and force a political fracture in the coalition before Germany collapsed. But beneath the thunder of panzers and the grand rhetoric of revenge, the operation rested on a desperate logistical hope. German formations began with fuel for only a few days of operations. Their advance assumed they would capture Allied gasoline dumps and turn American abundance against the Americans themselves. The offensive was therefore not merely a clash of tanks in snowy forests. It was a race toward depots, truck parks, road junctions, repair points, and kitchens. For years, Nazi propaganda had taught Germans to look down on the United States as a materialistic civilization without depth, a noisy republic of money, gadgets, and comfort. In a 1942 essay, Joseph Goebbels sneered that America's greatest technical accomplishments are refrigerators and radios, and mocked the country as spiritually empty, even while admitting, with a kind of resentful awe, that Americans naturally build the best airplanes and tanks, and by the hundreds of thousands. At the front, German propaganda leaflets tried to weaken American unity by targeting homesickness, prejudice, and social divisions, betting that a democracy built on argument and inequality would crack under pressure. The offensive in the Ardennes carried that assumption into battle, that the Americans were rich, yes, but softness always hides inside abundance. What those officers began to understand in places like that frozen kitchen was that American abundance at war was not decoration, it was doctrine. Long before the Ardennes, the U.S., Army subsistence planners had built an entire philosophy of feeding around a remarkably simple principle, that all troops, especially troops in combat, should receive the best food available in the best and most appetizing form within the realm of reasonable possibility. That sentence, bureaucratic on the page, becomes something far more consequential when carried into mud and snow. It meant food was not an afterthought. It meant appetites, morale, calories, shipping space, storage life, sanitation, and even the ability of exhausted hands to open a can in darkness had all been studied. It meant the Army did not think of a meal as a luxury to be enjoyed when convenient. It treated food as one of the mechanical parts of combat power. Field Ration A used fresh foods for organized messing when possible. Field Ration B substituted canned components when fresh supply failed. Field Ration C was a complete packaged day's food for the individual soldier. The K ration, compact and carefully designed, answered the need for assault and combat operations when kitchens could not follow. Even spice packs and beverage packs had their place in the system. The Americans did not simply feed armies. They built a moving nutritional architecture to follow them. So when German officers found kettles, cups, coffee grounds, ration tins, and service trucks arranged with near-industrial logic, they were not seeing softness exposed. They were seeing an entire civilization's administrative will made edible. The recurring object in that revelation was often not steak, not chocolate, not even bread. It was coffee. Coffee in a steel urn, coffee in soluble powder, coffee in packets. Coffee in the breath of men warming their hands around tin cups before dawn. The War Department considered coffee an essential element in the troops' diet because it lifted morale and welfare, and the Army requisitioned 10 times more coffee in 1942 than it had in 1941 before Pearl Harbor. That is not a trivial statistic. It is a map of priorities. In K rations, soluble coffee appeared in the breakfast packet. In C rations, powdered coffee traveled with canned food. In field conditions, soldiers sometimes had to heat water over tiny candles or improvised flames to make it. The cup itself could be bitter, burned, weak, overboiled, or medicinal. None of that mattered as much as the fact that it existed, reliably, repeatedly, across oceans and campaigns. Coffee sharpened alertness during night operations. It helped men endure fatigue. Medics even used hot coffee in treating the wounded, administering it by teaspoon to help stave off shock. In one factory at Marseille, American supply systems roasted thousands of pounds of coffee a day for the war effort. The coffee cup thus became more than a stimulant. It was a small democratic promise, endlessly renewed, that somewhere behind the line, someone still remembered the ordinary human being inside the uniform. German officers, shaped by a military culture where privation was often accepted as proof of hardness, could misread such attention as decadence from a distance. Up close, in the snow, they could begin to see it for what it was, organized endurance. That realization grew sharper when set against the German experience of supply in late 1944. The Wehrmacht still depended heavily on horses. In the Ardennes offensive, horse-drawn artillery and supply columns became tangled with motor transport on narrow, icy roads, slowing the movement of fuel, shells, and spare parts. German units were chronically starved for gasoline. The offensive itself had been launched with only a narrow fuel margin, and once delays began, shortage spread down the chain like rot through timber. Sepp Dietrich's forces burned precious fuel battering against Elsenborn Ridge. The 2nd SS Panzer Division was halted by lack of gasoline. Manteufel's tank units were crying for fuel by December 19th. Behind the dramatic maps of arrows driving west lay a simpler, colder truth. Many German formations in that winter had mobility on paper, but hunger underneath. Their hopes fixed on American dumps because their own system could no longer guarantee continuous forward life. The Americans, by contrast, had built a war machine that was vulgar in its scale and deeply modern in its habits. It was not merely that they had more. It was that they had made movement itself into an institution. Trucks, trailers, road signs, jerry cans, repair shops, depots, bakery units, fuel points, ration breakdowns, beverage packs, mess sections, each small part supported the next. That field kitchen in the snow was not an isolated comfort. It was the visible edge of a vast, invisible mechanism. The German officer who stared at it may have felt something that rarely appears in combat reports, not fear of enemy courage alone, but fear of enemy continuity. A brave unit can be broken. A functioning system is harder to kill. The details made the revelation almost cruel. A K-ration packet was not grand food. No one writing honestly about the war would pretend otherwise. It was compact, repetitive, and often cursed by the men who lived on it too long. But in its components, one can see the American habit of anticipating the small frictions of misery. The breakfast packet carried meat, biscuits, a compressed cereal bar, fruit bar, soluble coffee, gum, sugar tablets, cigarettes, purification tablets, a can opener, toilet paper, a wooden spoon. Dinner and supper packets brought cheese or meat products, biscuits, candy, beverage powders, bouillon, more sugar, more accessories. The older 6-can C ration contained 4,437 calories, a dense day's food built for separation from kitchens. Field Ration D provided 600 calories in a single bar for emergency use. Assault lunches were designed to give 1,500 to 2,000 calories between the opening of battle and the restoration of normal supply. Such facts sound sterile until they are imagined inside a frozen tree line where a man's fingers barely work and daylight is short. Then the can opener becomes a weapon against helplessness. The spoon becomes a small instrument of civilization. The soluble coffee becomes a memory of mourning. The German officers who rummaged through abandoned American service areas would not have found Roman grandeur or Prussian austerity. They would have found cardboard, tins, powdered drink, cigarettes, paper, spoons, sugar, bouillon, toilet paper, and labels. In another age, these things might have seemed trivial. In industrial war, they were evidence of a nation that had turned ordinary convenience into battlefield resilience. And yet, the Americans who received all this were not living a holiday. That is one of the most important emotional truths of the story. German officers could look at a steaming coffee urn or unopened ration cartons and imagine softness only if they ignored the men who had been standing beside them an hour earlier. The American infantryman in winter France was often wet, filthy, underslept, frightened, and hungry. In the oldest military sense, hungry not merely for calories, but for relief, rotation, shelter, dry socks, and certainty. Soldiers in the field frequently found it difficult even to boil water for their coffee. K rations, designed for short periods, were stretched beyond intended use in campaigns where kitchens could not keep up. Hot food could not erase artillery, frostbite, or the sight of a friend gone still in the snow. What it did erase, when it arrived, was a more dangerous thing: the feeling of being forgotten by the machine behind the front. That was the difference. German ideology often imagined hardship as a kind of moral refinery, as though deprivation itself could purify men into iron. The American system, for all its bureaucracy and awkwardness, worked from a less romantic and more formidable premise. A man who is fed fights longer. A man handed coffee before first light does not become less willing to endure. He becomes more able to do so again tomorrow. The kettle and the rifle were not rivals in this war. They were partners. American abundance did not soften the front. It kept the front from spiritually collapsing into the cold void that devours armies from inside. Behind that truth stood the colossal road miracle of the Western Campaign between August 25th and November 16th, 1944. For 82 days, the Red Ball Express ran almost without pause to sustain the Allied armies racing away from Normandy and toward Germany. At its greatest length, parts of the system stretched hundreds of miles round trip. Up to 140 truck companies were assigned to the effort. An average of 899 trucks went forward each day. By the end of the program, 412,193 tons of supplies had been delivered. Those numbers are easy to read and hard to feel, so they should be translated into motion. Engines coughing before dawn, headlights hooded, drivers forcing overloaded trucks through rain and dust, and then autumn cold, mechanics scavenging parts, cooks waiting on rations, tank crews staring at gauges, artillery officers measuring shell expenditure against what the road might bring tomorrow. The 1st and 3rd armies together could consume roughly 800,000 gallons of gasoline in a day. Food traveled in that same bloodstream with oil, shells, and spare parts. One veteran remembered handing jerry cans to a stranded Sherman crew, while Germans were within shouting distance. That is the distance between logistics as a staff term and logistics as lived experience. By late 1944, American power in Western Europe was not only the power of divisions, it was the power of continuity, the ability to keep men, tanks, batteries, bakeries, kitchens, medics, and fuel points in relation to one another over astonishing space. A field kitchen found by German officers in the Ardennes was therefore not a local curiosity. It was a roadside shrine to the entire American way of war. That is why the German hope of capturing American stores during the Ardennes offensive carries such tragic irony. German planners understood, at least dimly, that they could not match American abundance from their own depots. They would have to steal it on the move. Fuel dumps near Spa, Stavelot, and Malmedy became prizes because gasoline had become the true blood of the campaign. But the Americans were not passive owners of wealth. Their truckers raced to evacuate fuel and oil from depots in the path of the advance. Quick-thinking Belgians helped deny stocks to the attackers. German road jams lengthened. Units outran their own lifeline. American supply, battered but adaptive, bent without snapping. The German officers who found kitchens might also have seen destroyed stores, burned dumps, and evacuated supply point signs that the enemy understood exactly what mattered and would rather destroy it than let the offensive feed on it. This, too, was a kind of education. It taught that American plenty was not careless plenty. It was defended, organized, and, when necessary, denied to the enemy with ruthless practicality. The Americans might leave coffee grounds in a pot, but they would not leave a campaign's future sitting unguarded for long. In the Bulge, the Wehrmacht's dependence on captured Allied resources became proof of its own exhaustion. Every mile west made the offensive more powerful in appearance and more fragile in fact. The abandoned kitchen could therefore be read two ways: as an American setback in a local place, and as a German revelation that even American retreat still operated inside a larger system likely to recover faster than German success. There was another contrast, subtler and more profound, hidden within the steam of that coffee and the order of those ration crates. Nazi propaganda had spent years trying to convince soldiers that democracy was weak because democracy was divided. German propagandists targeted black American soldiers with leaflets designed to inflame resentment and encourage surrender, exploiting the undeniable injustice of segregation in the U.S. Action but participation. It was not proof that American democracy had fulfilled itself. It was proof that millions still insisted it was theirs to improve and defend. Even on the home front, the same logic held. American abundance at the front was purchased partly by restraint at home. Civilians accepted rationing not because the nation lacked coffee altogether, but because supply had to be directed, shipping had to be protected, and the military had to be fed first. The war ration book allowed roughly a pound of coffee per person every 5 weeks. Families were asked to stretch grounds and live with weaker cups so troops could drink at the front. Consumption on the home front fell. Complaints rose. Yet the sacrifice, though mild by the standards of occupied Europe, mattered in symbolic terms. It linked the factory worker, the housewife, the dock laborer, the ship convoy, the roasting plant, the quartermaster planner, the truck driver, the field cook, and the infantryman with numb hands waiting in a tree line. That chain is easy to overlook when history is told only through generals and offensives. But the German officers who found American kitchens were brushing against that chain with their own gloves. Every cup, every ration carton, every accessory pack implied a social contract behind the line. Someone in America was going without, so that someone in Belgium or Luxembourg could drink something hot before army and racial violence at home. They were not wrong about the hypocrisy. America in 1944 was not a finished democracy purified of its own sins. But the propaganda failed to grasp something essential. A flawed democracy can still generate fierce loyalty if enough of its people believe the promise is unfinished rather than false. Many Black Americans spoke of a double victory over fascism abroad and over inequality at home. Many of the soldiers who kept the Red Ball Express moving were Black troops performing one of the war's most crucial labors. So the trucks that hauled gasoline, rations, and coffee toward the front also carried one of the war's hardest truths. The American system was morally inconsistent, socially unjust, and still, in material and political terms, more open than the racial empire trying to destroy it. To German eyes trained by ideology, contradictions proved weakness. To millions serving inside the American war effort, contradictions became reasons to fight harder for what the country claimed to be. In that sense, the coffee earned by the road symbolized not moving again. In totalitarian imagination, the state commands and the people obey. In democratic war, the picture is messier, louder, compromised by politics and prejudice, but it can also be wider, because the sense of ownership runs further down into ordinary life. The abandoned kitchen in the Ardennes was therefore not merely army property. It was the material residue of millions of civilian decisions, industrial habits, and public consent.